The ledger entry that stopped her was dated March 14th, 1880. Not because of what it said, because of what it didn't. Rowena Sutcliffe had been cataloging the Ashbourne records for 11 days. By then, working her way through 4 generations of land leases, crop yields, and tenant agreements stacked in leather-bound volumes along the east wall of the library. She'd taken the position as estate archivist because the pay was decent and because her late husband's solicitor had been very clear about the state of things. The house in Gatineau would need to be sold by spring, and she needed income that didn't require explaining the gap in her employment history. An archivist asked no questions about the woman doing the archiving. That suited Rowena perfectly. She had not expected to find anything troubling. She had expected dust, but there it was. March 14th, 1887. A lease renewal recorded for the Prentice family of the South Pasture Lands, 43 acres along the creek bed. The terms were standard. The witness signatures were standard. The amount paid was recorded as 42 shillings. And then, if you followed that same lease number across 6 subsequent renewal entries spanning 31 years, you would find that the Prentice family had continued paying 42 shillings every single year, while every other tenant on the estate had seen their rates adjusted, renegotiated, properly documented. The Prentice records simply repeated. Same number. Same date in March. Same 2 witness signatures that Rowena was increasingly certain belonged to the same handwriting, different names. She set down her pen. The library was cold in a way that the fireplace at the far end couldn't quite reach. It was late November, and the light through the tall windows had gone gray by 3:30. Rowena sat very still for a moment, looking at the 2 columns of numbers she'd written in her notebook. What the records showed, and what they should have shown, based on the standard rate adjustments applied to every other holding on the Ashbourne lands. The difference, over 31 years, was considerable. She thought about leaving it. She thought about it seriously, turning the idea over the way you turn a stone to check what's underneath. She was here to catalog, not to investigate. She was here for 11 weeks, through to the end of January, and then she was going back to Ottawa to find something steadier. She did not need to involve herself in the affairs of the Ashbourne estate, or its current lord, or whatever complicated history had produced this particular set of numbers. She picked up her pen again and wrote the total at the bottom of the column. Then she underlined it twice. Lord Ashbourne, the 3rd Lord Ashbourne, whose given name was Charles Frederick Ashbourne, and who went by Frederick to distinguish himself from his grandfather, though in Rowena's private estimation there was very little about him that needed distinguishing, was not the sort of man who spent time in his own library. In 11 days he had come in precisely once to retrieve a hunting periodical from the side table near the door, and he had not acknowledged her presence in any way that could be described as acknowledgement. He had glanced in her direction the way you glance at a piece of furniture you're considering selling. She had heard enough about him from Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, to have a reasonable picture. Frederick Ashbourne was 38 years old, had inherited the estate at 26 upon his father's sudden death, and had since that time managed it with a combination of supreme confidence and spectacular inattention to detail. He relied heavily on his estate manager, a man named Geoffrey Crane, who had held the position for 22 years and who, Mrs. Holt said with careful neutrality, was very organized. Geoffrey Crane was also, Rowena had come to understand, the man whose handwriting appeared on 31 years of suspiciously identical lease renewals. She did not sleep well the night she made that connection. By morning she had decided that she would say nothing. This was not her concern. She was an archivist. She cataloged. She organized. She prepared the finding aids and the folder lists and the cross-reference indices, and then she went home. By noon she had pulled every file that bore Geoffrey Crane's signature and laid them out across the large central table in a sequence that told a story she hadn't been looking for and couldn't now unsee. By 3 o'clock she had written 4 pages of careful notes, with column references and date cross-checks, and the names of 6 tenant families who appeared, to varying degrees, to have been paying rates that bore no relationship to any standard scale she could identify. By the time the light failed, she had reached the same conclusion she'd been circling all day. The only person who could do anything about this was Frederick Ashbourne, and Frederick Ashbourne did not know she existed. She requested the meeting through Mrs. Holt, which was the correct channel. She wrote a brief note, explaining that she had encountered some irregularities in the historical records that she believed warranted the Lord's attention, and that she would be grateful for 15 minutes of his time at his earliest convenience. Mrs. Holt looked at the note for a moment, then looked at Rowena. "I'll pass it along," she said, which was not the same as saying he would respond. The response came 2 days later, delivered by Mrs. Holt, with the expression of a woman who has learned to carry difficult news without comment. Lord Ashbourne would see her Thursday at 4 o'clock, in the study. She had, Mrs. Holt added carefully, perhaps 20 minutes. Thursday arrived gray and damp, the kind of November afternoon that makes the interior of any stone building feel particularly permanent, as though the walls have been there forever and intend to continue. Rowena dressed as she always dressed, practical wool, sensible boots, and carried her notebook and her 4 pages of notes and the 3 ledger volumes she would need to show her work, and she walked down the long corridor to the study and knocked. "Come." The study was warmer than the library, and considerably more lived in, which was to say it gave the impression of a man who conducted most of his life in this room and left the rest of the house to function without him. Frederick Ashbourne was standing near the window, with a glass of something amber when she came in. He did not sit. He did not invite her to sit. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the library briefly, assessing, mildly inconvenienced. "Mrs. Sutcliffe," he said. "The archivist, yes, my lord, you've found irregularities. I have, in the tenant lease records, spanning approximately 31 years. I've documented the discrepancies here." She opened the first ledger on his desk, turning to the page she'd marked, beginning with the Prentice family's South Pasture renewal in March of 1887, and continuing through, Crane handles the tenant accounts. She looked up. "Yes, I'm aware of that." Something shifted slightly in his expression. "Not much. Enough." "What you're suggesting," he said, "is that my estate manager of 22 years has been—" "I'm not suggesting anything, my lord. I'm showing you what the records contain." She set the second ledger beside the first, open to her comparison columns. "These are the rates applied to the Prentice lease. These are the standard adjustment rates applied to every other comparable holding on the estate. The gap over 31 years amounts to," she turned to her notes, "to a figure I have calculated conservatively at £463. Frederick Ashbourne looked at the ledger. He looked at her notes. He picked up the second volume and examined the page she'd indicated, then set it down. "You've been here less than a fortnight. 11 days, my lord. And in 11 days you've determined that Geoffrey Crane has been defrauding the estate. I've determined that the records show a pattern of inconsistency that I believe warrants further examination. What that examination reveals is not within my purview to. Mrs. Sutcliffe." His voice was not unkind, exactly. It was the voice of a man who has decided on his conclusion before hearing the evidence. "Geoffrey Crane has managed this estate since before my father's death. He is thorough, he is loyal, and he has my complete confidence. What you've found is almost certainly a filing anomaly. Perhaps the Prentice family negotiated a fixed rate at some point. It would hardly be unusual, and I would ask you to confine your work to the cataloging you were hired for rather than—" "My lord," she said it quietly, but she said it. He stopped. She turned to the third volume. She had bookmarked this one differently, a slip of blue paper, because she'd known, when she found it, that it was the page that mattered. "This is the witness record for the 1887 renewal. These 2 signatures." She placed her finger beneath them. "And this," she turned to the 1901 renewal, "is the witness record from 14 years later. And this, the 1912 renewal, 14 years after that." She stepped back and let him look. The signatures were identical, not similar. Identical, in the way that 2 things are identical when they are copied rather than signed. Frederick Ashbourne was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you train?" he said. It was not what she expected him to say. "I studied records management in Ottawa, my lord. Before my marriage I worked for the National Archives for 6 years, and you're quite certain. I am certain of what I can observe. The interpretation of it is yours to make." He looked at her then, not the way he'd looked at her before, as furniture, as inconvenience, but the way a person looks at something that has moved unexpectedly. She held his gaze and waited. She was good at waiting. 11 days in a cold library had not been the hardest thing she'd done in the past 3 years. "I'll need to speak with Crane," he said finally. "I thought you might," she said. "I've prepared a full index of the documents I've referenced, with the volume and folio numbers, so that the records can be located easily during any conversation you choose to have." She set the index on his desk. 4 pages, neatly copied, every reference in order. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Sutcliffe." She collected her ledgers and her notebook and walked back down the long corridor to the library. She did not hear anything for 4 days. This was fine. This was not her business. She cataloged the remaining financial records from the 1870s, reorganized the deed box that had clearly not been touched since at least 1904, and began a proper finding aid for the correspondence series, which was in considerably worse condition than anyone appeared to have noticed. On the 4th day, Geoffrey Crane did not come to work. Mrs. Holt said nothing about this. Mrs. Holt was Rowena had come to appreciate. A woman of exceptional discretion, which meant she said a great deal by saying very little. The absence of Geoffrey Crane and the absence of any comment about Geoffrey Crane formed, together, a kind of statement. On the 6th day, Frederick Ashbourne came to the library. He didn't retrieve a periodical this time. He came in and closed the door behind him and stood near the center of the room, as though he wasn't entirely sure of the geography. Rowena set down her pen and waited. "I've engaged a solicitor," he said, "to review the accounts." "That seems appropriate, my lord. He's confirmed." Frederick stopped. Started again. "The pattern you identified extends beyond the Prentice family. There are 3 other tenants. The total amount is considerably more than your conservative estimate." She had suspected this. She had not said so. "I see," she said. Frederick Ashbourne moved to the window. Outside, the November light was doing its best, which was not much. The ground stretched away in gray and brown, the lime trees along the eastern path bare and patient. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it to the window, which she thought was probably the only way he knew how to say it. "You owe your tenants a remedy," she said. "The apology to me is secondary." He turned then. She wasn't sure what she expected, irritation perhaps at being corrected in his own house. Instead he looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like a man who was actually present in the room he was standing in. "The Prentice family," he said. "I want to understand. The total they've been underpaid over 31 years. £463 is the minimum. If you include the 1883 and 1884 renewals, which I now believe show the same irregularity, it's closer to 512. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a great deal of money." "For a tenant farmer," she said carefully. "It's generational." Something crossed his face, not quite shame but the near cousin of it, the kind of expression that belongs to a person who has just understood the weight of something they previously held lightly. "Yes," he said, "it is." She watched him stand there with it for a moment, the understanding settling in the way cold settles into a stone room, slowly and then all at once. "I'll need to go through the full records," she said. "All of them, not just the series I've already covered. If the pattern extends to the other tenants, as you've said, I want to be certain we have a complete accounting." She had said "we" without thinking. She noticed it a moment after, and waited for him to notice it too. He didn't seem to. Or perhaps he did, and it didn't trouble him. "How long will that take?" he asked. "Another 3 weeks, perhaps 4, depending on the condition of the earlier volumes." He nodded slowly. "Then I'd like you to continue." She picked up her pen. The weeks that followed were different from the first 11 days, though she would have been hard-pressed to explain precisely how. The work was the same ledgers, the same dust, the same gray afternoons and inadequate fireplace. But Frederick Ashbourne had developed a habit of appearing in the library in the early evenings. Sometimes with a question about a specific record. Sometimes ostensibly in search of a book he never seemed to find, and once or twice with no stated purpose at all, simply settling into the chair by the fire with a glass of brandy and remaining there while she finished her day's work. She had not invited this. She had also not discouraged it, which she recognized was a decision of its own kind. He asked her about Ottawa. She told him about the National Archives, the reading room with its long tables and the smell of old paper and the particular satisfaction of imposing order on documents that had long since lost theirs. She told him she'd trained under a woman named Helen Forsyth, who had catalogued half the colonial records of New Brunswick, and who believed, above all things, that a record was only as good as its finding aid. He told her about the estate, not proudly, not defensively, but honestly, in the way a person speaks about something they've come to understand they've managed badly and are only now beginning to reckon with. His father had trusted Crane completely. He had inherited that trust without examining it. He had, he said, been very confident in many things for a long time, which he was coming to believe was not the same as being right. No, Rowena agreed. It isn't. He looked at her sideways. She didn't apologize for it. My late husband was confident, she said, because she had not planned to say it, and the fact that she said it anyway surprised her slightly. He was confident about a great many things: the timber contracts, the investment with his cousin in Montreal, the plan to sell the Gatineau house and buy something closer to the center of the city. She paused. He was wrong about all of them, as it turned out, but he was confident right up to the end. Frederick was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "When did he?" 3 years ago. It wasn't an illness. It was a business matter that became a legal matter that became something he couldn't. She stopped. "It doesn't bear going into. The point is that I learned, after, that confidence and competence are different things, and that I had spent rather too long assuming they were the same. As had I," he said, quietly, without deflection. She looked up at him across the library in the last of the afternoon light. There was a quality to the silence in old houses that she had come to appreciate. The way sound was absorbed by stone and timber and the accumulated weight of years, so that a room could be quiet in a way that was not empty. The library was quiet like that now. The fire had settled. Outside the light was finally going, the sky past the windows a deep and even blue. "I'll have the final accounting ready by the end of next week," she said. "And then?" She considered the question. "And then I'll prepare the formal report with recommendations. You'll want to have your solicitor review it before you approach the tenant families, so that the restitution can be handled properly. And after the report," she set her pen down. She looked at the ledger in front of her, the columns of figures she'd spent 5 weeks learning to read like a language. Then she looked at him. "I have a position in Ottawa," she said. "Or rather, I have the possibility of a position. Nothing confirmed. There's considerable work still to be done here," he said. "The correspondence series alone. You said yourself it would take months. I said it would take months in worse condition than I expected. It is in worse condition than I expected. And you're the only person on the property who knows where anything is." She said nothing for a moment. Outside, the last edge of light was gone from the sky, and the library existed now only in the warm, contained world of the fireplace and the 2 desk lamps she'd positioned to illuminate the work. "I would need proper terms," she said. "A written agreement, a defined scope of work, and a defined timeline. Of course. And I'd like to install a proper humidity register in here. These volumes are drying out. Several of the 1840s ledgers are already showing foxing along the spines, and if they're not stored correctly, they won't survive another decade." He looked at her steadily. "Consider it done." She picked up her pen again. The ledger was open to the final series of tenant records, the ones she hadn't quite reached yet. The families at the north end of the estate, the ones whose records went back furthest, the ones she suspected would tell the most complete version of the story she'd been uncovering for 5 weeks. "I'll need the East Wing storage opened," she said. "Mrs. Holt said there are boxes up there that haven't been touched in 40 years. I'll have it unlocked tomorrow morning." She wrote a note to herself at the top of the next page. Volume reference, date range, items to be verified. The fire settled again. Somewhere in the walls of the old house something shifted. Timber, or stone, or simply the building adjusting itself to the cold outside and the warmth within. "Mrs. Sutcliffe," Frederick said. She looked up. He was looking at her the way she'd come to recognize over the past weeks. Directly, without the earlier gloss of indifference, without anything that was not simply attention. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving it alone." She thought about the night she'd sat in this same room with her notebook, and the total at the bottom of the column and the decision in front of her. To catalog, or to look at what the cataloging had turned up. "It wasn't something I could look at and walk past," she said. "No," he said, "I don't think you could." She turned back to the ledger. The North Estate records waited, patient and full of things no one had looked at closely, in a very long time. She opened the first volume. She began.